Okay, let's unpack this. We are continuing our deep dive into this huge package of source material. And before we get into any of the details, we have to just reset the main rule for how we do this. We don't argue. We don't do slogans. We don't do public sentiment. We show the page and we read it in context. That's it.
That is the entire mission here. It's all about calibration. We're taking those big public statements you hear, the ones about BC's model being unique or a world leader, and we're holding them right up against the text. If those claims hold up, we have to be able to find the proof right here in the document.
And today we're zoning in on one specific piece, Attachment 5, the jurisdictional scan. I mean, if BC's approach is really the shining example that others are learning from, the technical reasons why should be right here in this comparison to other places.
Exactly. And it's not just that it's in the package, it's where it is. Verifiability is everything.
Not just how good it sounds in a press conference.
Right. It's the difference between hearing a movie summary and actually reading the script. So to start, let's tackle the most obvious claim scale. How big is the program?
Okay, let's go straight to the text. I'm reading directly from the scan now. It says, quote, provinces such as British Columbia and Ontario have the most extensive shared living home share programs with structured vetting, monitoring, and safeguarding protocols.
Okay, stop right there. That's immediately interesting.
Yeah.
The text puts BC and Ontario right next to each other, side by side. Both are described as having the most extensive programs.
Wait a second. So if the text says BC and Ontario are basically tied for most extensive, how does that square with the rhetoric about BC being unique or, singularly leading the way? A tie kind of deflates the uniqueness claim from the jump, doesn't it?
It forces us to ask a better question. Most extensive just tells you about the size, the sheer number of people or homes.
The volume.
Exactly, the volume. But real leadership, especially in a system like this, it has to come from the quality of the safeguards, the rigor, not just the raw numbers.
Okay, that makes sense. So if scale doesn't prove it's unique, then we have to look at the technical standards. And this, I think, is where we find the real gap between a public slogan and the technical reality described in this scan.
Absolutely. And to really get what follows, we need to define a key term, the difference between something being a policy versus a regulation. It's everything here.
Yeah, help the listener out with that. What's the real world difference?
Well, think of it like this. A policy is internal. It's how an organization, in this case CLBC, decides it's going to operate. You could update it pretty easily, and enforcement is, well, it's often internal, managed through a contract. A regulation, on the other hand, is law. It's binding, it has the force of government behind it, and there are usually clear external ways to audit and enforce it. It's public, it's mandatory.
So policy is like a strong suggestion from inside the house, and regulation is a law you have to follow, or you face real external consequences. Okay, that distinction is crucial for what comes next in Attachment 5.
It is. So now let's look at how the scan describes the current state of safeguards in BC, keeping that difference in mind. We're going to have to break this quote down, because all the meaning is in the technical details.
Okay, walk us through it line by line.
First, the basic structure. Quote, in BC, while Althea BC has recently updated its home share and coordination standards and introduced a critical incidents policy, many requirements remain embedded in policy or contracts requirements, rather than regulation and, at times, uneven enforcement.
Wow. So right out of the gate, the document says even with recent updates, the foundation is still policy or contracts, and it adds that there's uneven enforcement. That's a pretty big caution flag about the whole system's legal footing.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
And it continues getting into transparency and how they measure success. Quote, monitoring tools and outcomes are not public. Incident timelines are less prescriptive than in Ontario or under Australia's NDIS, and there are no mandated clinical health review cycles or validated quality of life tools.
That's dense. But it really reads like a checklist of things that are either missing or just not up to par. Not public means no transparency, and no validated quality of life tools means you can't really prove if things are getting better for people against a standard benchmark.
Exactly. And did you catch the comparison?
Yeah.
It says BC's timelines are less prescriptive than in Ontario. Once again, Ontario is being held up as the benchmark for rigor, right there in the text.
And then it hits the most foundational piece, the rights protections.
Yes. Quote, cultural safety and tenancy protections are acknowledged in principle, but are not binding or auditable.
To acknowledge something in principle, but not make it binding or auditable, that's basically saying, we like the idea, but we can't prove we're doing it, and you can't hold us accountable for it.
That's a fair reading. So If that's the description of the BC model, what does the scan say is the gold standard?
The authors actually tell us. They put the counterpoint right next to it.
They do. They define the international bar. Verbatim, it says, internationally, best practice highlights embedding monitoring and incident reporting requirements in regulation, publishing inspection and safeguarding data, mandating health reviews in higher-risk homes, and adopting standardized outcome tools alongside independent oversight.
This is the moment. This is why our method matters. You take those two paragraphs, you put them side by side, and the contrast is just. It's unavoidable.
Dark.
The international standard, as defined by this very span, requires regulation. It requires published public data, mandated reviews, validated tools, independent oversight.
And the description of BC we just read, it highlights that key parts are in policy or contract, monitoring is not public, there are no mandated health cycles, and the quality of life tools are not validated.
So the document itself defines best practice and then shows how the current BC model, well, how it lines up against that. It reads more like a diagnosis or maybe a roadmap for improvement, not a victory lap for a world-leading model.
The document is doing its job. It's setting a standard and then taking inventory. And the takeaway for you, listening, is that this comparison is basically a list of things that need to be strengthened to meet that international bar.
Okay, so let's pivot for a second. Let's see what the scan says is working well in other places, because these examples are what define that benchmark BC is being measured against.
Good idea. Looking south to the United States, the scan notes that the federal CMS rules actually require tenancy protections and community integration.
So they're not optional?
No, they're federal requirements to get funding, a very high, non-negotiable bar.
Okay, what about overseas?
It points to the United Kingdom. They have a nationally regulated shared lives system. The document specifically calls out their strong inspection frameworks and their use of validated outcome measurement tools.
So an independent national system, strong inspection, using metrics that are proven to work. That sounds like it checks off almost every box the scan just said BC was missing.
It hits a lot of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Regulation, validated tools, oversight. And then you've got Australia. Their system runs through the NDIS Commission. And their strength is strong regulation that mandates things like worker screening, systematic audits, and outcomes monitoring.
Okay, so let me get this straight. The international examples are the U.S., with rights baked into federal law, the U.K., with quality driven by national inspection, and Australia, with rigor built through a national commission doing audits and screening.
Precisely. The scan is really useful here. It isolates what's strong in other places. But the whole point of this section is to show these global examples and, well, where exactly BC's world leadership is demonstrated hasn't really shown up yet. Not in this technical review.
This is so important. The text is showing what works well elsewhere, and then it's describing the current setup in BC, highlighting where regulation is the international norm, but policy is the local reality. The phrase world leader is just not jumping off these pages.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, the tone changes when the scan comes back to BC. It gets cautionary. It starts talking about local pressures and risks.
Yeah, it paints a really clear picture of a system under a lot of strain. It says, quote, in BC specifically, there is a growing risk that home share has become the default rather than a true choice, driven by housing shortages, cost considerations, and the lack of alternatives. This has led to mismatches, breakdowns, and crisis placements.
That is a very stark assessment. The idea of it becoming a default instead of a true choice. That suggests the system is being driven by scarcity housing shortages, cost not by what's actually best for the person.
And the result is spelled out right there. Mismatches, breakdowns, and crisis placements.
Yeah.
That idea of a good model becoming the default because there's no other choice, that feels so relevant to so many policy areas right now.
It does. And the scan notes that while CLBC is trying things, piloting hybrid options to create more choice, it describes these efforts as fragmented. So the picture you get is of a system under pressure, trying to manage risk, not one operating from a position of, unassailable strength.
So to put a final frame around all of this, the scan gives us the big picture trend, the global context. It says, quote, over the past decades, disability policy in many jurisdictions has shifted away from institutional models toward community-based, self-directed living arrangements.
And that sentence right there, that's the final test for the word unique. If this big shift toward community living is a broad global trend that's been happening for decades in many jurisdictions, Then what exactly is the unique mechanism or safeguard or regulatory innovation that BC has?
The burden of proof just shifts right back onto the public rhetoric because based on this document, Attachment 5, the model is extensive, yes, but not unique in scale. And it's structured with a reliance on policy where best practice points to regulation and public data.
So our conclusion on Attachment 5 has to be, well, it's pretty unavoidable. This document is excellent for setting standards. It flags vulnerabilities, it flags gaps, it flags local pressures. What it does not do is explicitly back up the public claims of being a world leader based on its current configuration.
And that feels like the honest and verifiable place to stop for today. Attachment 5 gave us the framework for comparison, but it left us with an inventory of improvements, not a steel-proof case for world leadership. It defined the gaps much more clearly than it defined the glory.
Which sets up our next deep dive perfectly. We now have to go through the rest of the package, sections 3, 4, and critically, the recommendations list. We need to see what's being proposed for the future of the system.
Right. Only after we see what they're recommending for the future can we go back to those words, leader, unique, and really map out where the package supports them and where the document just ends and, inference begins.
And for you, the listener, the takeaway here is that when you hear that kind of powerful rhetoric, your first job is to find the written context and really focus on that distinction we talked about, internal policy versus external regulation. That's the only way you can really calibrate the claims against the verifiable facts.
We will see you on the next deep dive.